My name's Kathy, and here I am today at Slate Hill Cemetery. And as my t-shirt says, I believe every headstone here has a story. Slate Hill Cemetery is on what now is Yardley-Mooresville Road, which was a big traveling road even back in the day. You see our historic highway sign behind us. Slate Hill Cemetery was founded in 1690. Now we have to go back and learn a little bit more about the Falls meeting to put all the pieces together. To start with Slate Hill Cemetery, we go back to England, when King Charles II gave William Penn the land of Pennsylvania to pay off a debt owed to Penn's father. Now, we know that that's complicated, but we're not going to delve into that story today. The Falls Quaker meeting started in Falsington Homes around 1680 and became formalized a few years later. Penn was connected to many of the members there and even visited the first meeting house in 1701. Quakers had their weekly meetings, and then they had administrative meetings. So there was the Falls monthly meeting, and then there was the Bucks quarterly meeting, and then their yearly meeting was in Philadelphia. In the late 1680s, the Falls Quaker meeting decided that they needed an additional cemetery for Quakers in the kind of Yardley area. The first plot of land was donated by Quaker Thomas Janney, a prominent Quaker minister and close friend of William Penn. His son later donated the second part of the Quaker side in 1721. The picture you're seeing is the original 1690 deed, which we are in possession of. During this time period, Quakers did not use headstones as they were considered a sign of vanity. So you can see in this picture, this large area here that has no headstones. We did a ground penetrating radar and have found over 140 unmarked graves on this side. Thus far, we've been able to connect about 30 to known burials. And before we end this part of our story, I just want to let you know that Slate Hill was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1992. So the Quakers were the beginning of the abolition movement. The first written protest against enslavement came from the Germantown Friends in 1688. The Philadelphia yearly meeting, which as you remember I said the Falls meeting was part of, criticized the importation of slaves in 1696, so pretty early on. They objected to slave trading in 1754, and by 1775, they basically said they were going to disown members that enslaved people. The Society for the Relief of Freed Negroes Unlawfully Held in Bondage, now that's a name, was the first abolition society founded in 1775 in Philadelphia. Of the 24 original members, 17 of them were Quakers. Eventually it became known as the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, and they worked with Benjamin Franklin, who was a Puritan, not a Quaker, to advocate for federal changes in the law. Turning to the Pennsylvania government, throughout the 1700s, the Pennsylvania Assembly attempted to discourage the slave trade by taxing it. At this time, and until the time that William Penn died in the around 1718, the Quakers were very much in control of the government. In 1780, finally, they got the Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery passed in Pennsylvania. So the good news was this was the first abolitionist law in the country. The bad news is, actually, out of all those laws that came through the early 1800s, it kind of was the latest. And by that I mean nobody was unenslaved in 1780.
What the act did is if a person was born before 1780, they remained enslaved for their life. If they were born 1780, March 1st, 1780 or later, they were not enslaved, they were free, however, they were indentured to their mother's owners until age 28. Between 1790 and 1800, the number of slaves did drop from 3,737 to 1,706.
By 1810, it dropped further to 795. This is at the point at everybody who had been born at 1780 should have been freed by, right? By 1840, there were still 64 slaves in the state, but by 1850, they were gone. So in 1776, the members of the quarterly meeting, the Bucks one, voted to begin visits to Quakers who had enslaved members, or enslaved people in their homes. And they were also documenting both the owners and the enslaved people and their ages. This is the year after Philadelphia meeting, the yearly meeting, had voted to begin disowning Quakers who had enslaved people. James Moon, a prominent Quaker from Falls, wrote a diary about these efforts. He wasn't the only person who did the visits, but he's the one who documented it. On their first day of visits, the 7 friends went to 4 homes. 2 of them freed their slaves that day. 1 said they would consider it, and the final couple said, no, and we're on the list for repeat visits. The reason I'm standing in front of this headstone for John Brown Sr. is that one of the places that they visited 4 times over the years was his son, John Brown Jr. John Brown was visited 4 times. Time 1, no. Time 2, he said, slavery is bad, but maybe I'll free my enslaved adult woman, but did it. The 3rd visit in 1777, John and his wife decided to free Savina Long, the woman that they had enslaved. And on the 4th visit, he freed an adult male, Peter, and 2 children, Hannah and James, but they would be freed at the ages of 18 and 21. So those Quaker visits were quite successful in a lot of matters. One of the other homes they visited in 1777 was Thomas Janney's. Now you remember Thomas Janney, his grandfather gave the land for this property. So he was a grandson. They visited him a while, but he did not ever, free his enslaved that we know of. James Moon kept his diary through 1781, and at that point he said all the Quakers in Bucks County had freed their enslaved. The only thing was there was a few couples where the woman had been a Quaker and married out of the religion, which kind of meant that usually she was disowned, that in a couple of those cases they weren't able to free the slaves. All right, on this side of the fence is what we call the segregated side. The reason we call it the segregated side is the only people that we have documented as being buried here are black. This piece of land was donated by Joshua Anderson, who actually lived right across the street on a piece of property that was part of the original Janney grants. He was in the Revolutionary War. He donated it in 1788 as a public cemetery. Now, whether it was always supposed to be a black cemetery or not, that we can't tell. We do know that in 1782, Joshua Anderson did register as having an enslaved person. All right, these are the Ganges brothers. Now, we know we have another Ganges buried here because of the death certificate, but we don't know if he's connected to these 2 gentlemen. Now, we're going to go back to the federal laws, because in the Slave Trade Act of 1794, they passed an act that prohibited the building and outfitting of ships in U.S. ports for the slave trade. So they made it even stronger in 1800, and basically at that point, you could, if you found a slave ship, you could take it over and get a reward. So in 1800, the USS Ganges captured 2 slave ships and found 137 naked people. They were brought into Philadelphia, and they were in a quarantine center, and a judge ruled that they would be indentured. They would be released to the PA Abolition Society that I spoke about earlier, and then they had a plan to indenture them to different people in the community. The judge also ruled that their last name was all going to be Ganges, after the ship. Mostly, these people were indentured to Quaker families, and they actually had to they had to have a bond, and they had to educate them, they had to teach them a trade, and when they left, they had to give them clothing and money. 18 members were placed in Bucks County. we suspect these brothers come from a Samuel that was listed there, but we cannot prove that. We know their father, his name was Samson. Now, I talked to an extensive Ganges researcher, and he thinks Samson came from son of Sam, i.e. Samuel. But again, some of that is speculation, right? We do have an 1823 tax record that there was an adult Samuel and a child Samuel. Both of these gentlemen fought in the Civil War. So most of what we know, well, pretty much all of what we know about William is because of his veterans application, because he fought for 11 years to get his pension, and I think basically got it right before he passed. Torbert got his pension actually pretty quickly, but most of how we know about him is a lot of newspaper articles, because he was a very colorful man. So there was a murder. It was a big murder in Bucks County of an elderly couple, the Burt murders, and the murderer escaped. He ended up in Torbert's backyard. We believed at that time he lived over in what we call now the 5 Mile Woods area. Torbert went to the authorities and told them where he was, and they found him. Now, there was a big reward for this murderer. It was $1,000, and in those times, and Torbert was known to be poor because he was constantly being arrested for stealing chickens and stuff. Torbert put in for the reward. Now, they definitely did not want him to get the reward, and the sheriff that he brought to arrest the murderer, this is a complicated story, fought him for the reward. Anyway, Torbert got a little less than $500. However, he did not necessarily use it well, and he kept getting arrested, and he was in the penitentiary, and then ended up, unfortunately, dying in the almshouse that was in Doylestown. All right, so now we're going to talk more about how the contemporary Quakers influenced this area. Sam Snipes was a local Quaker whose name might be familiar to those who live in the area because Snipes Farm still exists to this day. He was a descendant of the Moon family. Remember, I talked about the Moon family via Jane Moon Snipes. Samuel was the person who really, at Falls Meeting, took on caretaking for this cemetery when they still owned it till the 90s. His son, who we met and came and visited with us, told us about being dragged over here as a kid to mow the lawn. Sam also was always worried about how the cemetery was being cared for. There was definitely great gaps of time where it wasn't cared for. There's an article in 1975 where the local Black community was in outrage. They called this side of the cemetery covered in brambles and beer cans. But Sam took care of it, and in the early 90s, he facilitated a transfer of the ownership of the cemetery to Lower Makefield Township, and at that point, we became responsible for it. Sam was just a legend in this community. He was a civil rights advocate, and he also represented Daisy and Bill Myers, the first Black family to buy in Levittown. So, as we've shown you, there's like a lot less stones in this area. And we also have, I talked about the ground penetrating radar earlier, about 80 unidentified burials over here that we're working on finding. The other Ganges brothers is one of those. Now, how we know some of those people are here goes back to another Quaker. What's his name? Jesse Morris of Morrisville. The death certificates post 1906 are available online, and everyone that I have found that matches somebody in this side of the cemetery, the segregated, all had the same undertaker, Jesse Morris. And when I did some research on Mr. Morris, he was burying a lot of these people in his 70s and 80s. And I really wonder about the story where he became the undertaker who buried the Black families and how that all happened. I kind of suspect maybe a lot of other people weren't doing it. Now, going down some further generations, we know that it's been very hard for us to track down the stories of people on the Black side of the cemetery. I mean, some on the white side too. Women and people of color are not very prominent in historical records in general. Hannah here is one of those people. So what we know about her, we know from Sam Snipes' son, who came for a visit, is Hannah Clark. Got it? Who is that Hannah Clark? How we have a story about her at all is she became connected with the Snipes family. Now, she was a caregiver for daughters of the Price family, and she loved those girls and took care of them. And so the story that we were told by the Snipes, because we only really know, the other history we know is she worked in Delaware as a servant in 1870, and she shows up in Bucks in 1880 as a servant. That's when she shows up as a servant for the Price family. So one of the girls that she took care of, we think it was Mary, was jilted by a suitor, a local Quaker farmer named Henry Comfort. Hannah, allegedly, caught this man on the way out the door and said, "Henry, I put a curse on thee. May thee never have a live child." He married 3 times, and all of his children were stillborn or died in the first year of their lives. Now, this is a story passed down through the Snipes family, but it's also calls for reflection that what we know about this woman who lived in our community all comes through a white family that she was associated with.
I want to thank you all for coming on the journey today to learn a little bit more about Slate Hill Cemetery, the Quakers' involvement, and some of our residents here. I wanted to leave you with a few questions to reflect on. The Quakers had a strong conviction about the abolition of enslavement and worked hard to end it. Are there any issues you feel a strong drive to act to support or fight against? The video also brings up issues around history, how history is told. We rely on records and stories. How do you think that affects what stories get told or do not get told? Thanks again.